Hi, I'm Tim Kelsall, and welcome to this panel on leaders, coalitions, and political settlements. In this first presentation, I'm just going to give you an introduction to the research on which the panel is based, before my colleagues in later presentations will provide more of the substantive findings. So all the research is based on work that was conducted by the Effective States and Inclusive Development Research Centre at the University of Manchester. This was a centre, it was a research consortium funded initially for 5 years by DFID and then given another 3 years of funding for a second phase of research. And what the research tried to do was to establish the conditions in which elites become committed to inclusive growth and development policies, and also the conditions in which they were motivated to build the state capacity which could actually deliver on inclusive development policies. Its main theoretical approach, the theoretical lens it applied, was political settlements analysis. I'll explain a little bit more about this later for those who are not familiar with the term, but it drew very heavily on the work of Mushtaq Khan and on the work of Brian Levy as well. So in its first phase, ESID used what it called an adapted political settlements framework in 13 countries. And it looked at the effect of the political settlement, or perhaps should I say, it explored developments in various policy domains through the lens of the political settlement. And those policy domains encompassed things like economic growth, natural resource governance, women's empowerment, health, education, and a range of others. Now, this research, I think it was largely fruitful, but it did produce some ambiguities, especially when it came to definitional issues around what a political settlement actually was, and also measurement issues. ESID employed a typology into which it categorized various countries and their political settlements. But sometimes it just wasn't all that clear into which quadrant or cell of the typology a particular country in a particular period fell, and it didn't have any very clear means of resolving these measurement ambiguities. So in its second phase, one of the things ESID has done has been to try and refine the definition of what a political settlement is and to provide clear grounds for measurement. So let's start with the definition. Well, in this project, we really looked at the genealogy of the term political settlement, and we tried to produce an encompassing definition which was faithful to its origins in peace and conflict practice and studies, but was also able to incorporate the new developments in political economy theory as associated with Mushtaq Khan and Brian Levy. And so we ended up defining a political settlement as an ongoing agreement among a society's most powerful groups over a set of political and economic institutions that are expected to generate for them, that is the powerful groups, a minimally acceptable level of benefits, which thereby ends or prevents generalized civil war and or political and economic disorder. And we can illustrate that definition with this little diagram here. So we have powerful groups, which will be arranged in a particular way, who form an agreement to end conflict on the basis of a set of political and economic institutions or rules of the game which they expect or anticipate will deliver to them an acceptable distribution of benefits. Now, there have been lots of debates about, well, what kind of an agreement does this need to be? Does it have to be formal? Can it be informal? Can it simply be tacit? Does there even need to be an agreement at all? I don't want to get into those debates in this presentation, just note that there are some debates there. But just looking at this encompassing definition, we see that it provides opportunities for approaching political settlements analysis in a variety of different ways. So one could, if one wanted, focus in or zoom in on the nature of the agreements that underpin political settlements. Some of these are formally enshrined in peace agreements, for instance. So you could look at the impact of peace agreements on subsequent developments in economy and society. Or you could zoom in on political and economic institutions. So you could look at whether democracy or particular forms of democracy or particular kind of structures of an authoritarian state are associated with better development outcomes. But in ECID and in I suppose reflecting a lot of what has been done in political settlements theory previously, we were actually particularly interested in the left-hand side of this diagram. So we were interested in who the powerful groups are that agree to political settlements and how are they configured, and then the impact this has on the way in which benefits are distributed, either for development or not, as the case may be. So moving on, the work we did that stemmed from this definition produced two new variables. So we remained interested in the configuration of powerful groups that some of you will be familiar with from the work of Mushtaq Khan in particular. But what we did was we collapsed the horizontal and vertical dimensions of his theory into a single dimension, what we called the concentration of power. So that's the, well, we might think about that in terms of the geometry of power. And here I think we go beyond Khan and Levy as well to look at the social composition of power, perhaps the sociology of power. And the two new variables are the following: power concentration. This is the degree to which the settlement concentrates power in and around the de facto leader of a country, or disperses it among other individuals or groups. And then the second variable is the social foundation. That is the degree to which the settlement is based on a broad, deep foundation of powerful groups, or a more narrow one. So think about that just for a moment. And now I'm going to show you a diagram which hopefully represents this, helps you to visualize it. So we use these new variables to produce a new typology. So on one axis we have the social foundation, which can range from broad to narrow. And on the other axis we have power configuration, which can range from concentrated to dispersed. So if you look at that diagram there, you'll see that in the top left quadrant are broad dispersed settlements. Actually, looking at this, it seems as though I might have got the, I might have mislabeled these axes. So apologies for that. I don't actually have time to redo this, but just take my word for it. The top left quadrant is broad dispersed. And here you have a situation where there are a lot of different groups that hold power, but there's no really very clearly defined center of power, or if there is, it's not very strong. If you move to the top right, sorry, let's go down to the bottom left, a narrow dispersed settlement. Here, actually, rather few groups hold power, or rather a sort of a narrow segment of society holds power, and that power is dispersed. It has no really clear center. If we go now to the top right quadrant, this is a broad concentrated settlement. You'll see that a large sector of society has some kind of power, but it's arranged in a fairly vertical or concentrated configuration, so that there's a group at the top in which power is concentrated. And then finally, in the bottom right quadrant, narrow concentrated, here again only a narrow range of groups holds power, or a narrow segment of the population, but that power is actually quite concentrated. And what we hypothesize is that this geometry and sociology of power produces different development outcomes. And my colleagues Bill and Matthias will explain this in much more detail in the following presentations. So I want to talk now a little bit about measurement. So after having defined these variables, we then had to find a way of measuring them. And what we decided to do was an expert survey of 42 countries in the global south. So how did we select these countries? Well, we excluded countries which were, and I should say that this survey ranged from either 1945 or independence, whichever was later, to I think 2018 was our the latest year that we surveyed. And we excluded those countries which were below a certain size at 1945 or independence. I think it was 500,000 probably, that had a certain degree of reliance on natural resources at independence or 1945, and that were above a certain level of GDP per capita as well. And the countries that were, all the countries that remained, we surveyed. But you'll see that that leads to a sort of concentration of surveyed countries in Africa and Asia, not too much in Latin America, and none in Europe. So we had 126 country experts. This was 3 experts per country. And we began by dividing each country's history into periods. And we periodized countries according to major changes in leadership or politics. And we found it very difficult to say conclusively when a new political settlement had started and another had ended, or at least in some cases we did. So we don't claim that these periods are political settlement periods per se. What we do say is that each period represents either a change or a significant evolution in the political settlement. I can answer questions about that if people want to know about it later. And we had 27 questions for each country period. So if anyone's listening that helped us code these countries, I offer you 1,000 thanks, because this was a very, very labor-intensive process, because maybe the average country had between 5 and 10 periods. You've got 27 questions for each period. And some of those questions were actually very, very detailed and required quite a lot of either quantitative thinking or qualitative detail. But the end result is that we have a very rich data set now about the evolution of political settlements across countries and across time. So I don't have the precise figure to hand, but I think we must have data for more than 200 political settlement periods. And the survey asked many different questions, but they can be sort of summarized thus. So, what was the size, social composition, and relative power of the coalition or bloc that is loyal to the leader? How is it structured, and internally with respect to other blocs? What is the size and social composition and relative power of the coalition or bloc that is contingently loyal to the leader? How is it structured internally and with respect to other blocs? And then, what's the size and social composition of the relative power of the coalition or bloc that is opposed to the leader? And what we hypothesize is that relations among these variables allow us to construct our power, concentration, and social foundation variables. So the results allowed us to code country periods typologically, and in this table I show you a few archetypal cases. So if you think back to the diagram of a few slides ago, the broad concentrated settlement, it's the one with it's sort of a broad-based pyramidal structure of power. And examples of this would be Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya, 1970-78, Abdul Razak in Malaysia, 1971-75, Paul Kagame in Rwanda, 2000 to 2018, and Kenneth Kaunda in Zambia, 1964 to 1967. Moving now to it would be the top left of our typology, so that's a broad dispersed settlement where power is sort of dispersed throughout society. A lot of people hold it, but the centre is not particularly strong. We have Kofi Basia's Ghana, 1970-71, Manmohan Singh's India, 2004 to 13, Kikwete, Jakaya Kikwete in Tanzania, 2006 to 15, and also Yingluck Shinawatra in Thailand, 2012 to 13. These are archetypal cases, I should say. They're kind of at the outer edges of our typological codings. And I hope that if you know those regimes, you can sort of recognize this description of them. Moving on to narrow concentrated settlements, we have General Park in South Korea, 1961 to 63. So this would be a kind of probably a pyramidal structure of power, but it's a very narrow pyramid, certainly at its base. Mobutu in Zaire, 1966-73, Meles Zenawi in Ethiopia, 2005 to 2012. I was a bit surprised by that, actually. I thought that Ethiopia under Meles might be broad concentrated, but our expert coders seemed to, well, they gave us answers which led us to code it as narrow concentrated. And then perhaps a really archetypal case is South Africa between 1961 and 75. Moving finally to narrow dispersed settlements, so only a narrow segment of society holds power, but even so there's no real strong centre. We have Jimmy Morales, Guatemala, 2016 to 2018, Norodom Ranariddh in Cambodia, 94 to 97. The latter years of al-Bashir's government in Sudan, and also the regime of Yahya Khan in Pakistan, 1969 to 1970. So as I say, I hope that some of you will recognize those regimes and feel that we've placed them in the correct place in our typology. So, moving on, we were able to go from coding to hypothesis testing. So, we were able to test some of our hypotheses about the relationships among political settlement variables, types, and development outcomes. So we had two approaches to this, small set QCA and large N regression. Now, just to explain to people who aren't too familiar with these approaches, QCA has sometimes been described as a Y-centered approach. So it asks what causes development, whereas regression is more of an X-centered approach. It really says, do these particular variables matter for our outcome or not, in this case, development? Well, we did a small set QCA, and then we also did a larger set QCA. And to be perfectly frank, this didn't yield very clean or significant results. So it showed that our variables are neither necessary nor sufficient for better development, though they did figure in some varied and complex pathways to both social and economic development. But we also did large N regression, and that yielded much clearer results. And it's those results that Nikolai is going to concentrate on in his presentation. So to summarize and to preview our findings, we're going to see through the other presentations that the size, structure, and relative power of the leaders' coalition does affect both economic growth and social development. And now it's over to the other presenters to provide more detail on our predictions and findings. Thank you. Okay, thanks very much for listening to that. And next up will be Bill Ferguson's presentation. So Nikolai, if you could load up that video, that would be great.
How context influences development, political settlements, and collective action problems. Purpose of this talk: this paper offers theoretical background for our approach to political settlements. This approach informs inquiry into political and economic development. Motivating questions. 1. How can we characterize a set of underlying political conditions that influence prospects for development? 2. How do such conditions relate to associated collective action problems that permeate developmental processes? Origins of this project. A series of ESID workshops and conferences on political settlement analysis held between October 2017 and September 2019, academic visits to Manchester's Global Development Institute and Amsterdam's AISSR, along with collaboration with other members of this panel on a proposed book for Oxford University Press, my recent book, Stanford Press 2020, The Political Economy of Collective Action, Inequality, and Development, which is a sequel to my 2013 Stanford book, Collective Action and Exchange, a game-theoretic approach to contemporary political economy. Core statements of this talk. 1. Achieving economic and political development requires resolving underlying collective action problems, or CAPs. 2. Institutions facilitate resolving complex collective action problems. 3. Political settlement analysis offers conceptual foundations for systematic investigation of developmental CAPs. Specific types of political settlements underlie distinct institutional configurations that arise from and shape development. Categorizing political settlements, therefore, facilitates social scientific analysis by identifying context-specific sets of developmental collective action problems. Outline for the talk. I'll begin with 3 background concepts, develop a typology of political settlements, discuss CAPs and implications, and conclude. First concept, development. I'm going to use Amartya Sen's capability approach. Development signifies steady, widespread improvements in economic and political achievements and underlying capability sets. Economic development implies growth, equity, education, health, basic infrastructure, and services. Political development implies building state capacity, a rule of law, public accountability, legitimacy, and broad access. Second concept, collective action problems, or CAPs. These arise when the pursuit of individual self-interest leads to undesirable outcomes for some group, be it a nation, a city, a community, a family, and so forth. CAPs are ubiquitous, and I would argue that this is an underutilized concept that can be a foundation for political economy. There are two basic types. First-order CAPs relate to free riding regarding provision of public goods, limiting negative externalities, both broadly defined, limiting use of common pool resources, and limiting excess conflict. Second-order CAPs relate to creating mechanisms that can enforce and coordinate sufficiently to render agreements on first-order CAPs credible and therefore implementable. Development often requires resolution of second-order CAPs prior to first-order. Without credible coordination and enforcement, why should parties bother negotiating resolutions to first-order CAPs? Third concept, political settlements. A common understanding held among elites and powerful organizations that establishes politics rather than violence as their key mechanism for resolving disputes. Political settlements underlie the creation of institutions, institutional systems, and social orders, and shape their evolution. They follow punctuated equilibrium dynamics. From here, what I want to do is categorize types of political settlements and then discuss their implications. So I'm going to use a two-dimensional typology of political settlements, which is largely based on Kelsow and von Howe, 2019, with several extensions. First dimension will be the social foundation of a political settlement, which can range from narrow to broad. Second dimension, the configuration of authority or power, which can range from unipolar or concentrated to multipolar or dispersed. Analysis then is going to trace implications of each of these dimensions within each of four quadrants. For two of these quadrants, I'm going to additionally designate two distinct developmental paths. To add agency to structure, I assume that elite motivation is focused primarily on political survival, and I'm going to generate some implied collective action problems for each type. So, more details. First dimension, social foundations. The social foundation designates politically salient groups that are included in a political settlement. These groups may be categorized by ethnicity, religion, class, and so forth. The included groups are insiders, and this is not the same as a party in power, exclamation point, or even a regime. It's a broader concept. What kind of groups must policy respond to, whether or not they formally participate in government? This ranges from broad, nearly all salient groups are included in the settlement, to narrow, many are excluded. Rationale: the degree of inclusion characterizes the basis of support for a political settlement. It's going to influence its stability. Exclusion can undermine settlements, and it will influence insider goals regarding the distribution of benefits. Inclusion versus exclusion, then, this distinction will depend on disruptive potential. That is, the ability to undermine a political settlement. Group with significant disruptive potential will be included. They'll be insiders, or else the political settlement will not form or last. Caveat, unless they're successfully repressed. Excluded, then, are repressed via force, divide and conquer techniques, and/or symbolic manipulation, or they're entirely ignored, as would apply to marginal groups with little power. Second dimension of the typology is the configuration of authority, the COA, or power. This reflects the coherence of political authority amongst insiders. It ranges from functionally unipolar or concentrated to multipolar or dispersed. Unipolar settlement signifies a coherent allocation of decision procedures and authority resolved prior collective action problems. Multipolar has no such coherence. Broad policy decisions require renegotiation. There's little agreement on basic questions regarding relations between the state and the market, the role of religion in society, and so forth. Rationale for including this: the COA influences insider ability to resolve future caps and to develop state capacity. So here is our basic typology of political settlements. On the vertical axis, social foundation ranging from narrow to broad, and on the horizontal axis, configuration of power or authority ranging from multipolar to unipolar. So each of the quadrants now in detail. First quadrant has a broad social foundation and a multipolar configuration of authority. With a broad social foundation, many groups have disruptive potential. This gives any ruling coalition an incentive to provide services broadly across groups. But we've got a multipolar COA, which means the insiders are factionalized. They have unresolved internal collective action problems, they lack direction, and they have low state capacity. This combination then generates a vulnerable political settlement. There are few external groups, but factionalized insiders might disrupt it. The continuous need for renegotiation means that they're going to focus on distributing short-run benefits. They will rely on clientelism, rent-sharing, populist parties, have a weak rule of law. Personal relationships will be more important than impersonal rules. But this type of settlement does have substantive accountability to groups via the need to distribute benefits broadly. Examples of this type of settlement would be India or Ghana. Caps for this type of settlement: reduce patron-client relationships without undermining stability by antagonizing potentially disruptive groups, extend accountability beyond short-term benefits and patronage to longer-term capacity building with some form of procedural accountability, create more insider unity, less need for negotiation via collective choice rules, especially regarding transfers of power given the multiple interests. This would be a type of political insurance. Enhance state capacity without loss of accountability. These are all difficult. Quadrant 2, broad social foundation, unipolar COA. Broad social foundation, again, incentive to widely distribute benefits. Unipolar, however, means we've got resolved caps. Insiders have a potential to build state capacity. Combination then means that the political settlement exhibits state capacity and some degree of substantive accountability. The political settlement has a delicate balance between retaining its broad social foundation and retaining enough coherence for unipolarity. There is, however, a potential for developing accountability, rule of law via transfer of power, and economic structural transformation. But will they realize this potential? Q2 has two developmental paths, which help answer that question. Path A, developmental state. They will focus their state capacity on building economic institutions. Usually there's some prior institution building going on. Path B, a patronage state. The need for allegiance creates a politicization of short-term public services rather than institution building. Both paths still have a potential for repressing excluded minority groups. Distinguishing A from B. Two conditions. This is related to DRS 2005. One, to get path A, you need a resource constraint. That means a lack of point source resources or easy agricultural exports or substantial long-term foreign aid, and mutually understood external or internal threat to elite political survival, where the mutual understanding is key here. For path A, conditions 1 and 2, plus the broad social foundation's need to distribute, motivates creating functional economic institutions for their survival. Path A examples: South Korea 55 to 87, Taiwan, same period, possibly post-1994 Rwanda. Path B, Uganda, excluding the North, 86 to 2001. Caps for both paths broaden input into the ruling coalition decision-making without undermining functional unipolarity, enhance accountability without more factions, strengthen political institutions related to transfer of power and a rule of law, end neglect and repression of excluded groups, mean broadening the social foundation without undermining functionality or stability. Path A, additional caps transforming a rule of law into a rule by law into a rule of law, usually by establishing workable institutions that regulate transfers of power. Second, creating procedural public accountability without undermining stability. Okay, now on to quadrant 3, narrow social foundation, and back to multipolar. Narrow social foundation. Few groups have disruptive capacity, therefore insiders have no incentive to offer broad social benefits. The political settlement is also vulnerable if the excluded can attain resources and resolve organizational caps, meaning if they can attain de facto power. This gives the insiders an incentive to repress and neutralize the excluded groups. On top of this, they're multipolar, they're factionalized. Unresolved internal collective action problems, lack of direction, low state capacity. Combination means we've got a few factionalized groups. There's elite competition over rent. Parties seek connections with factions to gain power and benefits. There's dim prospects for a rule of law or accountability. And some elites may defect and ally with excluded groups, as Francisco Madero did in the 1910 Mexican Revolution. Examples: pre-Marcos, Philippines, Ecuador, Nigeria, South Sudan. Caps: they need to create some kind of functional unipolarity among the rival factions, create collective choice rules, broaden the social foundation without more factions, reduce reliance on rent without more factions and undermining stability, create some accountability, initially via more inclusive and less conditional clientelism, again without increasing multipolarity or threatening stability. Very tall orders, all four. Finally, Q4, narrow social foundation, unipolar COA, narrow social foundation, little incentive to broadly distribute benefits, and incentive to repress and exclude. Unipolar, however, means that they've resolved some caps. They do have a potential to build state capacity. How then will they use this state capacity? Again, we've got two developmental paths, which I call C and D. Path C, a proto-developmental state or limited dictatorship. State capacity is used to generate selective rule by law institutions for economic development. There is still low public accountability. Diaz regime, 1870 to 1910, Mexico. Suharto, Indonesia. Pinochet, Chile. Path D would be a predatory state, no accountability or rule by or of law. State capacity is used to repress excluded and seize assets. Examples: Central African Republic, Equatorial Guinea, and Pol Pot, Cambodia. C versus D distinction is going to reflect some resolution of prior commitments to caps for C, and again, they need to have some kind of a resource constraint. Caps for both C and D. They're large stability developmental trade-offs. Development may empower outside groups and undermine stability. Broaden social foundation without losing stability, state capacity. The excluded resentment may enhance the difficulty of this. Reduce repression without destroying the political settlement or generating a civil war. There's a two-sided commitment problem here. Will the powerful honor a promise to reduce repression or cede power? If they do cede, can the formerly repressed credibly commit to not punish the perpetrator? we might consider Chile's transition to democracy or Mugabe's peaceful resignation, as opposed to what happened in Syria with the reaction to initially peaceful attempts at regime change. Some of these trade-offs in quadrants 1, 3, and 4 can be represented by a civil war coup trap game, details in my book. This combines the state capacity logic of Besley and Pearson with Rossler's notion of a civil war coup trap. For the game, we assume two coalitions within the political settlement. A is the initial ruling coalition, B is the opposition. Ruling coalition can co-opt groups via provision of public goods that are denied to the excluded groups and coalition-specific transfers. Implications of the game: 1, a resource curse tends to generate political violence. 2, probability of coup depends on coalition A's distribution of resources to the army, its legitimacy within the army, and pre-existing social cleavages in the population. Incentives for staging a coup are going to decline in more prior institutional development, larger gains from public goods, greater legal capacity, and more developmental structural transformation. These, by the way, could all generate testable hypotheses. Conclusion: the concept of political settlements offers a foundation for analyzing relationships between distributions of power, institutions, social order, and basic collective action problems that often impede political and economic development. 2, a typology of political settlements thus offers a conceptual foundation for developmental social scientific inquiry and policy analysis. Works cited in a longer presentation. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much, Bill. The eagle-eyed among you might have noticed that Bill, who prepared that presentation before our final codings were in, categorized South Korea as a broad and concentrated little settlement, whereas for at least part of General Park's rule, our actual codings show it to be narrow and concentrated. One reference there, Bill referenced DRS 2005. That refers, I think, to an article by Dona, Ramsey, and Slater, which is on systemic threats and vulnerabilities. Okay, so now I want to call on Matthias, and he's actually going to speak to his slides. So I need to, there he is, he's coming up on stage now. Hi, Matthias.
Hi, Tim. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining in this late on a Friday afternoon. And yeah, as you see, this is a live presentation. And yeah, this is a co-authored paper that I'm working on together with Sam Hickey and Benjamin Chimuni. And we're very much looking forward to your feedback, as this is still work in progress. And in a way, what we try to do in this paper is to build on the discussions we had in the political settlements group with Tim, with Bill, with Nikolai, and draw on the conceptual framework and make it speak to the scholarship on state capacity and state building. Next slide. And so so basically the literature we seek to engage in this talk is, I think, what has been pretty much established is that state capacity matters a great deal for achieving inclusive development outcomes. At the same time, there's a lot of debate around sort of then the question of, so why do some countries or some subnational units in countries have greater state capacity than others? And there is a large literature on that. And this literature is dominated by structural and historical institutionalist explanations. So you have scholars that focus on, sort of that explain long-term differences in state capacity by looking at variations in population densities. Think of Herbst's works on Africa here, folks that work on the ethnic demographics, the ethnic composition of populations, others who look at geography, climate, and yet the Bellicist approach who looks at international warfare. And then you have a large literature that looks at the institutional legacies, of colonial, but increasingly also of pre-colonial patterns, variations in state centralization, and to explain contemporary variations in state capacity. And I think this literature is very good, or has made a lot of progress in establishing, sort of looking at long-term, why are there broad regional variations between different regions in the world, but also why, for example, we have differences in state capacity between, let's say, Bolivia and Mexico and Latin America, or or France and Spain in Europe. But what these works are less well attuned to are at least two, if not three things. First, they're less suitable to explain what we call state capacity deployment, sort of what state capacity is actually put to work for. Second, these existing approaches are kind of overly structural and often don't pay a lot of attention to the agencies of rulers and elites. And finally, and that will come out in the case studies, it's very hard to use these approaches to explain like relatively rapid changes in state capacity over a time frame, let's say, of 10, 15 years. And that's exactly what we try to, where we try to bring the political settlements approach to work. Next slide. So basically, the political settlements approach here is used to inject politics and a greater attention to power configurations and the agency of rulers into the analysis of state capacity. Next slide. And we're building pretty much on Tim's and Nikolai's and Bill's work here. When we talk about political settlements, we distinguish them along two dimensions. First of all, the power concentration. To what extent is power concentrated in the top leadership or not? And then with respect to the social foundation, to what extent does the leadership need to take broader organized parts of the population into account in its policy decisions? All right, next slide. So what I will do, I will very quickly, this has been a moving target so far, so I will talk a bit about state capacity and its deployment, and then develop our framework in more detail, and then apply it to case studies of Rwanda, Burundi, and Uganda, and then I conclude with putting it into the bigger picture. Next slide. All right, on state capacity. Broadly, it's a contested concept. Some think about state capacity as the ability of states to implement the goals they've set out for themselves. That's Fukuyama. Others think about state capacity as the ability to get actors to do what they otherwise would not do. That's Migdal's more relational approach to state capacity. And the problem with those approaches is that it's often very hard to get at those that these definitions conflate the outcome they're interested in capacity as something more latent, that might be put forward and used or not. So therefore, in our view, we draw on a broadly Weberian space, and first, in state capacity in a narrow sense refers to the quality of the bureaucracy and its reach throughout state territory. Next slide. And when we think about state capacity in that way, sort of state capacity, sort of referring to broadly to the professionalism of civil service and its presence throughout society, then this then begs the question: when, where, and for what purposes is this capacity deployed? And that obviously depends on the policy domain, and that's really where political settlements enter into analysis. So basically capacity deployment is indicated by such things such as tax ratios or patterns of healthcare provision, the rolling out of educational programs. That's really, that's state capacity deployed. All right, next slide. So I think, I talked about this in a way already, So political settlements, in our view, helps us to put power relations in the agency of rulers to the analytical forefront, and it allows us to also to focus on when and how state capacity is deployed. And then also, I think it's important to keep in mind here that in that way, political settlements are also quite useful for policy purposes, because it allows us more so than the existing structural, long-run historical approaches to pinpoint, to focus on particular policy domains and also variations within countries. Next slide. Okay. So, can you go back to the previous one, Nikolai? Oh, no, go back. Okay, click forward. Okay, so then let's look at the first dimension of political settlements and state performance. And here the key distinction is between dominant, dominant versus competitive political settlements. And in dominant settlements, political power is concentrated in the hand of the top leaderships, whereas in a more competitive one, its political power is more dispersed through different governing coalition, and there is a constant struggle for political survival. How does this impact on state capacity and state performance? Next slide. Power concentration, we suggest, affects state performance, state capacity deployment by, first of all, by looking at shaping the time horizon of that rulers have. So in dominant settlements, the time horizon is longer. It's not necessarily bound by electoral cycles, whereas in competitive settlements, the time horizon is usually much shorter. The second aspect here to emphasize is that in dominant settlements, we expect that rulers are more likely to offer political protection to particular state agencies to build capacity and deploy this capacity. Okay, so that's for the first. The second dimension here, with respect to the social foundations of a political settlement and state capacity, is that the crucial link here is systemic vulnerability and elite threat perceptions. In a settlement with a broad foundations, leaders are more likely to build bureaucratic competence, state capacity, because they perceive themselves as vulnerable to systemic threat. They feel that they feel obliged to a large variety of organized social groups with disruptive potential, and they feel that they need to take these groups and their interests into account in policy making. And that means that in those broad settlements, leaders are, ceteris paribus, more likely than to engage in sort of the construction of impersonal public state bureaucracies that are capable of delivering public services, sort of to the wider population in society. Whereas in narrow political settlements, where the ruling coalition is feels less obliged, or it feels obliged to, in policy terms, to respond to the core members of the ruling coalition, there is less systemic vulnerability, and therefore state resources are usually used to cater to a small range sort of the core membership of the ruling coalition. Okay, so these are the two relevant dimensions of the political settlements framework and its implications for state capacity. Okay, so that's the slide I initially wanted to talk about power concentrations. Okay, cool. Look, let's right now put these analytical arguments to work for our case studies, which are Rwanda, Burundi, and Uganda. And we chose them because they are strikingly similar, but also in some ways different in light of the existing explanations of state building and state capacity. And moreover, these existing explanations have a hard time to explain contemporary variations in state capacity and its deployment. So all three countries are classified low-income economies in sub-Saharan Africa. They're tropical, landlocked country. Their population is dense to very dense, especially in their regional context. Rwanda and Burundi are similar in that they're, in the mainstream literature, often classified as ethnically homogeneous, but we know that they're obviously politically quite polarized around ethnicity, whereas Uganda is seen as like one of the most ethnically diverse countries in the world. So that kind of sets Uganda in that sense is different from Rwanda and Burundi. And next slide. When we look at the institutional variables that are often emphasized in the literature as potential explanations of state capacity. So all three countries are classified as semi-authoritarian with respect to political regimes. In terms of international wars, sort of the driver that's often emphasized in the literature, historical literature on European state building. There's been little involvement in these kind of large-scale, all-out wars. Then all three countries were colonized, experienced indirect rule, Rwanda and Burundi under Belgian colonialism, Uganda under British. And then I think a key variation here, and I will pick up on that later, is Rwanda and Burundi have, with respect to pre-colonial state building, are considered as fully centralized, having sort of state-like centralized political entities, whereas Uganda, that was only partially the case. Okay, so these are kind of like when we look at the wider context, and here, but then in terms of the outcomes we're interested in shedding light on, these existing variables are very limited, or somewhat limited. So in Rwanda, since 1994 and the end of the civil war and the genocide, the state building project has been one focused on the construction of an impersonal public bureaucracy. And when we look at standard indicators of bureaucratic capacity, has been rapidly improving. And then also when we look at indicators of capacity deployment, public services have been improving. In Burundi, the story is very different, in the aftermath of the civil war. So there has been no systematic state building project. Rather, what we witness is widespread patronage. This is also reflected in standard indicators of bureaucratic capacity, and also a stagnation in many, not all, but in many of the public services. And then Uganda is an interesting contrast, because here in a historically less centralized states, what we witness is not an impersonal public bureaucracy that's constructed, but the systematic construction of pockets of efficiency until 2001, and also with bureaucratic capacity rapidly improving. But that changes quite drastically after 2001, when the support for political support for pockets of efficiency wanes and patronage increases. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. So here broadly, to put some initial evidence on the table. So the world governance, I'm aware of its limitations, but that's, in terms of data, accessible data, first step at this. So government effectiveness, you clearly see the pattern of Rwanda improving, Uganda stagnating, and Burundi even declining. Next slide. Similar, even more clearly shown when we look at the indicator on control of corruption. In Burundi, this is declining, in Rwanda improving, and Uganda declining. So next slide. But also, when we look at state capacity deployment, and here we focus on health, the health sector, which has played a quite prominent role also in the importance of policy terms. And here we look at, for example, at maternal mortality trends, and in Rwanda they have been declining quite dramatically. In Burundi, much less so, and in Uganda, and both of these countries are even above the sub-Saharan African average. Next slide. So how can we, from a political settlements perspective, for these variations? Next slide. So this is kind of the bare bone version of our argument, which in the case of Rwanda and Burundi focuses on the contrast in the social foundation of the political settlement, and in the case of Uganda on this shift from dominant to competitive. All right, next slide. So when we look at power concentration in Rwanda and Burundi, in both countries, after a military victory, former rebel groups transformed into dominant ruling parties with both a military and a political wing. These parties were internally cohesive and faced comparatively little elite competition, elite opposition. So in that sense, we classify them as instances of power concentration. Next slide. But what varied between Rwanda and Burundi are the social foundations of the respective post-conflict settlements in these two countries. In Rwanda, the Rwandan Patriotic Front has been largely Tutsi-based and remained very concerned about the return of ethnic strife with the Hutu majority, and therefore employed sort of an inclusive, the attempts to build an inclusive ruling coalition, and that was embedded in an anti-ethnic, pro-national discourse, and in efforts to construct an impersonal state institutions in order to. In the contrast to Rwanda, in Burundi has been that the CNDD, FDD, has been largely Hutu-based. There's been no systemic threat perception among the leadership, and in that sense, there's been less pro-national anti-ethnic discourse and less systematic effort in engaged state building, but rather, sort of what became rampant is patronage patterns for members of the ruling parties, and that was what state resources became used for. Sorry, I ran out of time, so I'm happy to answer any questions you might have on the case of Uganda. But to conclude, what the political settlements approach seeks to do is to complement existing historical institutionalist accounts of state building with a focus that takes power relations, agencies of leaders more serious, that's capable of looking at changes over the medium and short run in state capacity that these more historical explanations cannot explain, and also with important policy implications. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much, and sorry for going overboard in terms of time.
Yeah, thanks, Matthias. I couldn't get my mic on earlier. Anyway, I'd like now to invite Nikolai to play his presentation, which will be the last presentation of this session. Thanks.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for joining. The aim of this last presentation, titled Do Political Settlements Matter? A Large N Regression Analysis, is really to apply the dataset that Tim introduced earlier to the theories that were just presented. And specifically to see and test whether political settlement theory helps to explain development outcomes in a large N setting. And before I get into the nitty-gritty of the research design and the outcomes, I just wanted to present and recap some of the key hypotheses that we are going to test. There are 5 somewhat oversimplified working hypotheses that we want to test. First, with regard to power concentration, namely that holding all other variables constant, higher power concentration should lead to faster development, speaking both of social and economic development here. And so this is really the Kanyan typology that is tested here per se. And then adding the Ascidian social foundation size dimension to the typology, and assuming that holding all other variables constant, higher social foundation sizes will lead to faster development. And then joining the two into one, we would assume that countries with high values in power concentration and the social foundation size at the same time would develop fastest. So really thinking here about the broad concentrated type of our typology to perform best with regard to. And we would then expect that countries with low values in power concentration and social foundation size should actually develop slowest. So specifically speaking here about the narrow dispersed political settlement. And lastly, that countries with low values in power concentration or social foundation size should fall somewhere in between. Now, the aim, as I stated before, is to test these hypotheses using our large N data set. And as units of analysis, we have 2,418 country years, which correspond to 42 countries or are derived from 42 countries. But essentially, looking at the main specification that I will present later on, we're usually looking at around 1,300 country years, given that many of the control variables used will have a lot of missing data. Now we are looking at two outcomes specifically. First, economic development, which we measure through the annual growth rate in GDP per capita, and social development, which we measure through the annual growth, or rather the reduction in a country's infant mortality rate. And all the outcomes in all specifications are forward-leaded by 1 year, so they are measured in t+1. This is identical to lagging all the variables by 1 year, so t-1. And the reason for that is really to counter reverse causality, assuming that if the independent variables occur before the outcome, it is harder for the outcome to actually affect at the same time the independent variables. And the models are fairly robust to using longer leads. And with regard to the explanatory variables, we actually use three combinations of the power configuration and the social foundation size variables. First of all, we actually include both separately but within the same model. This is really to test hypothesis 1 and 2, that each of these variables by themselves helps to explain development outcomes. Secondly, we actually join those two by multiplying them, so creating a joined index. And it's important to note that high values in that index are only possible when a country has both high values in power configuration and with regard to the social foundation size. And so here we're really testing H3 and H4, so that just higher values here will lead to higher development outcomes. And lastly, to look more specifically and disaggregate, if you want, these dimensions, or to organize them into the different types and see how they rank against each other with regard to explaining development, we actually create a 4-categorical ISIT typology variable, which by using the sample means as the dimensional cutoff points, this then helps us to specifically test hypotheses 3 to 5. Now, we include a range of controls in all the models. So specifically, we use country and year fixed effects in all models. The country fixed effects help to account for all time invariant potential confounding variables. So that would include variables such as the colonialist or geography, or more stable features in the culture, whereas the year fixed effects help to account for more temporal specific shocks that affected almost all countries in the sample, such as the oil crisis. But we do also include a range of additional control variables, specifically controlling for time variant variables, such as the log GDP per capita, which controls for the convergence effect, polity 2, which controls for regime type, income from oil, gas, and coal per capita, as well as the net ODA received as a share of GNI. And lastly, standard errors are clustered at the country level, which is done to account for potential heteroscedasticity and serial autocorrelation in the panel data. Now, let's take a look at the results. And first, let's specifically focus on testing hypotheses H1 and 2, so including the social foundation size and the power concentration within the same model, but separately from each other, so not joined in an index or a typological variable. And what we find is strong support for those two hypotheses. The social foundation size and the power concentration variable are highly significantly and positively associated with GDP per capita growth. And we can see that the effect for social foundation size is that for each 1 percentage point increase in the social foundation size, we see a 0.05 percentage point increase in GDP per capita, whereas when looking at the power concentration, we see that if we go from the lowest value, the lowest observed value in power concentration in our data set to the highest one, then we see a 3.54 percentage point increase in GDP per capita. And the same dynamics hold with regard to the infant mortality rate. So here we're looking at a reduction, so minus values actually indicate a positive outcome here. And again, we find that both are highly significantly associated with infant mortality rate reductions. Now, looking at the index, so really seeing the overall power of that typology rather than the two variables or dimensions separately, again, we find that the typology finds support within our data set. Namely, again, going from the lowest value to the highest observed value with regard to that data set, we find that GDP per capita annual growth increases by 5.31%, or is associated with a 5.3% percentage point higher increase in GDP per capita. And again, this result is also found with regard to infant mortality rate reduction. Thus, up to now, the large N regression analysis of our data strongly supports both the Kantian and the Euclidean typology with regard to explaining development outcomes. And now let's lastly look at how our disaggregated types, ICID typology types, do with regard to explaining development and how they rank against each other. And here it's first important to note that the broad concentrated settlement serves as the base or the reference level here, and so will always be 0, and that the other categories will be included as dummies that are in their effect referenced against that reference category, the broad concentrated settlement. And specifically what we find is that all the other coefficients of the other political settlement types are negative. And what that means is that essentially the broad concentrated settlement is indeed the one that appears to be growing fastest, as expected in our third hypothesis. And the narrow concentrated settlement is actually the one growing second fastest. The narrow dispersed political settlement is the third fastest, or the second slowest if you want, and the broad dispersed is actually growing fourth slowest. So interestingly, we would have assumed that narrow dispersed settlements would perform poorest, but actually it's broad dispersed settlements which here significantly are doing much worse than broad concentrated settlements. But in general, we find a fairly close fit with the assumed pattern. And now if we go and look at the infant mortality rate, again, we see that the broad concentrated settlement appears to be performing best with regard to reducing the infant mortality rate. The broad dispersed settlement is doing second best. So here we really see that the social foundation size seems to be working rather strongly within the typology. Narrow concentrated is then doing better than narrow dispersed, which again is also fairly logical that concentrated settlements are doing better than dispersed ones. But overall, we find that the results really strongly match with our expectations. So conclusions and takeaways. Political settlements matter also in a large N setting. The new ICID typology helps to explain development outcome, as does Kahn's. And quantifying political settlements is possible, and we would say is valuable. And to conclude with a way forward, we think that more robustness checks are necessary, for example, with generalized methods of moment models, which help to go even further against the pretty serious issue of reverse causality in such models. And disaggregating the power concentration variable, so Kahn's typology, into its core dimensions would also be interesting for further analysis. And simply it would be really interesting to test our political settlement models and typologies against other outcomes out there, such as conflict or corruption and other typical outcomes of interest in the political economy literature. Thanks so much for listening.
Great, thank you very much, Nikolai, for that recording. Okay, well, that's all the presentations finished. So it'd be great now to get some questions. We've got quite a lot of you in the audience, and some of you I know are experts in this field. So if you have a question, perhaps you could type it into the question field now, and we'll bring some of you up on stage. Okay, so I'm going to, there's a question from Jeremy Seekings. How stable over time does a political settlement have to be in terms of your scores for it to constitute a political settlement? I think Nikolai will clarify this. I think we took a minimum period of 2 years. Is that right, Nikolai?
Necessarily a political settlement, as Tim mentioned in his presentation, but to actually code, a period had to last at least 2 years for experts to code it.
Great, okay, and now I see that I have 2 comments from Mushtaq Khan, to whom we are all indebted. So I'm going to invite him up onto the stage now and hear with some trepidation his comments.
No, first let me congratulate ESID on its excellent work. And I think the work on political settlements is by no means finished. It's an ongoing, as many of you have said, it's a very exciting ongoing project. Just a couple of comments. I think we need to be very careful in not presenting the political settlements results in a form that can be easily shot down by people who don't think it's useful. So, for example, to say that political settlements explains growth, or to say political settlements explains development outcomes in a simple way, is actually not the object of the exercise. And as soon as you start to say that at a very detailed level, you have to make so many qualifications and so many other things come in, like natural resources and wars and blah, 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 that someone who is not convinced of it might say, what is the point of it? And as the last presentation showed, a lot of these results aren't even statistically significant, right? So it's the sign is right, but it's not significant. So I think I just want to make 2 points. One is that what is it that the concept, the framework is useful for itself needs to be discussed. And I think it's useful to understand, so this is my position, that the configuration of power and capabilities in a context helps us to understand what kinds of policies and institutions work and what doesn't. And when you use it for that, you find really interesting and powerful results. And a lot of my work has been along those lines. It's very interesting that ESID chooses to put, in an attempt to make the concept more linear and therefore more suitable for numerical measurement, you've collapsed the distribution of power into one variable, and you have a new variable called the social foundation. In my original work, I actually looked at the configuration of power in politics as one of the variables of the distribution of power, and the other one was the distribution of power and capabilities across organizations in the economy. Now, that part of the original political settlements framework has been completely ignored by most people. But I think that's the equivalent of your social foundation, right? So the danger of putting, South Korea and Zaire in the same box is that as it turns out in your classification, is because you're not looking at the configuration of capabilities in the productive sector. If you did that, so the configuration of power also depends on the configuration of capabilities. And a country like South Korea had a bunch of firms which were much more capable than they were in Zaire at an equivalent time or stage of development, and they were linked to the politics in a different way, right? So you have one pattern of power which comes by looking at the capabilities of organization. So power can be based on the fact that you're productive, but those powerful organizations may or may not be networked with powerful political forces. And politics generates power not just because it is productive, it can generate power because of organizational capabilities. And then you have a really complex set of permutations. If you take my, the power configuration in politics with the power configuration in economics, you have many permutations. And the problem, as I understand it, is then very difficult to come up with a simple typology. But I would say you really don't want to put South Korea and Zaire in the same box. They're actually not similar political settlements. So let me be provocative. Would it really matter if our detailed analysis of power in the economy and in politics actually showed that each country was quite different from every other country and was quite different from what it was before? In my perspective, it wouldn't actually, because we would have a very good understanding of the configuration of power in this country now, which would help us to do a lot of analysis of what would work and what wouldn't work. So I think there is a danger. I mean, there's an advantage of explaining things to people by putting things in 2x2 boxes, but the 2x2 boxes can actually detract from what we are trying to do. We're trying to understand how the configuration of power matters, and the subtle differences there might be just as important as the big differences, right? And the subtle differences might operate in sectors. So the power sector in Bangladesh is quite different from the NGO sector in Bangladesh, which is quite different from the garments industry in Bangladesh. And to say there is a political settlement in Bangladesh and we can explain its growth rate relative to India, how helpful is that for someone who is not already convinced about the usefulness of the concept? They might come along and say, actually, it doesn't help me at all. So we have to be careful about how we present it, because we all agree, everyone, I think, all of us, that it's a very powerful concept. But we have to use it actually to derive results which other concepts don't help us to get. Sorry to take up so long. Thank you very much. I enjoyed these presentations very much. I could go on for much longer. I have lots of questions. We will continue this conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Maybe I can respond first, and then Nikolai. I have to be very brief. Thank you for those comments. I mean, I think that Easter pursued two tracks. If you're not speaking, would you mind muting, possibly? ESA did employ political settlements framework in a policy analysis type of way, and it used the concept of policy domains to explore those more subtle differences among political settlements and the interactions between different sectoral capabilities and development outcomes. But we also thought that it would be interesting to see if political settlements could be used as a more general sort of meso theory of development, and whether it would stand up against other sort of large N explanations of development, such as we find in regime theory and so forth. Therefore, we did try to create this typology and test these variables. I will say that when it comes to the distribution of power and capabilities among organized groups, I mean, we did include questions in our survey about the power and capability of indigenous firms. So we have some data which speaks to your particular theory. We haven't presented it here, but we have that. We can put that into the mix. So those are just two brief responses, but I think Nikolai can comment on the statistical significance of our findings.
Yeah, maybe just a general comment. I mean, we totally agree it's a complex matter, and the point of the large N is not so much a deterministic exercise, but a probabilistic one to see whether on average we see that certain types of political settlements actually do better, as is done in the large N kind of political economy literature. To be brutally frank, we initially were skeptical whether we will find significant results, but we're actually quite happy to find them. And we thought that we would have to interact them with other factors, such as the economic organization, such as systemic threat levels, such as foreign intervention, natural resources, etc. But actually, it was interesting enough to find that on a probabilistic level, on average, both your typology and our extended one seem on average to be positively associated with different outcomes. But we're totally aware that this is a fact, and there's more research to come trying to interact different variables with each other, just in the significance. So the core models were those first ones, not the categorical typology one, and they're highly significant, really very robust. I was personally quite surprised. The ones which are not consistently significant are the typological ones. And the reason here is, so the directions are clear and some of the dummies are significant. The reason here why we see less significance is because we basically kill a lot of the variation by putting it into 4 boxes. And so we think there's a lot of variation between those boxes, which we capture in the other variables, but here we kill it. And thus, there's by default, there's going to be less significance. So that's kind of the issue there. But generally, yeah, we agree. We, as Tim said, we included a lot of like economic organizations, so their power respective to government, and as well as the capabilities, although we're not too happy with the capabilities one that didn't work out too well. That was a little bit tougher. But yeah, so that's just on that. But we totally share the sentiment in general.
Okay, I think, well, Sam Hickey has a question which I think is directly relevant to this, so I'm going to bring him up on stage. Sam, if you're ready to ask that question.
Sure. Actually, I wrote it a while ago. I think I wrote it. The main issue is whether you've using the same outcome data on both growth and human development indicators. Have you tested whether a political settlements reading gives us a more robust explanation of those results than a regime type reading using quality score or that?
Right. So, as mentioned, we always we include the political typology or the regime type variable by polity 4 in all our regressions as a control variable. And what we find is in the specification that I showed that regime type is not longer significant in explaining economic growth, although it is in explaining social development or, say, infant mortality rate reduction. That is what we find. But I will say as a caveat, usually you should be careful when interpreting control variables because they should have their own model. But at the same time, the second caveat to that caveat is that actually the control variables included in the model would be very similar to the setup if we were just looking at how democracy or autocracy does in explaining development. So yeah, it seems that settlement seems more robust in explaining, significantly explaining economic growth in terms of infant mortality rate. Both still remain significant.
Thanks.
Okay, great. And we have a question here from Isaac Haruna Ziaba. I hope I've pronounced that correctly, from the LSE. So Isaac, I'm going to bring you up to ask that question.
Hi, Nikolai.
Hi, Isaac. How are you doing?
Thanks for the presentation. I think very interesting findings, and the fact that you are able to do some quantitative work in political settlement. You found on the GDP growth kind of indicator that the broad concentration, the broad concentrated settlement seems to be the fastest growth, sees the fastest growth in terms of GDP, whereas the broad dispersed settlement had the slowest growth. I was wondering if you could kind of, give us examples of broad dispersed settlement in terms of maybe randomly telling us about a country that fits both the broad settlement and the broad concentrated settlement, and telling us if your findings really apply to them.
Maybe Tim can also jump in terms and think while I'm starting to talk about this in terms of cases. I'm just gonna, so the findings I presented right now are pretty fresh, so we haven't really been able to digest them as much as we wanted. But let me say here that it really seems to be that in terms of economic growth, the power concentration aspect seems to be particularly important. And I might imagine, if you think about the South Korean context, although we think that's, well, it depends. In certain contexts, it's a broad concentrated, sometimes it's a narrow concentrated context. But especially this concentration aspect might be particularly helpful in creating those governance capabilities to push industrial policy. Whereas for social development, this a breadth of a political settlement, really distributing socially is more important, and that's not something we really saw in South Korea, for example, that much. And so that's something where I'm going and explaining that finding, and maybe some examples, but maybe Tim wants to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, and just to say the distinction between a concentrated and a dispersed settlement is to do with the power of the ruling coalition, and in particular the way we operationalize this. In Mushtaq's original theory, you have the ruling coalition, which is divided into sort of internal factions, and then there are excluded factions. And when the ruling coalition is strong vis-a-vis both its internal factions and its excluded factions, then you have a potentially developmental coalition. So the way we operationalized that was to look at the blocks around and their relationship to the de facto leader of the country. So those that were sort of loyal to the leader represented our sort of core bloc, and then the internal factions of the ruling coalition would be those groups that were only contingently loyal to the leader. And then the opposition bloc, what we called it, or what Mushtaq would call the kind of excluded factions, were those that did not feel represented by the leader at all. And the difference between, or some examples of broad dispersed settlements would be Kofi Busia's Ghana, for instance, in 1971, where you had, which superseded the military regime, but was a very weak government with a weak centre of power, and was very rapidly overthrown. And also the government of Manmohan Singh in India is another example we found, which came at the kind of outer edges of our distribution, where you have it's a broad political settlement because you have a lot of organized groups in society with the power to sort of change or influence or disrupt the settlement. But the center, the institutional center of that power, the group around the, well, not the institutional center, but rather the power group around Manmohan Singh himself is comparatively weak. So Manmohan Singh can rely on really, only has the loyalty of a rather small group. And that group, its power vis-a-vis these other groups is weak. So I hope that satisfies you. And I had another point in response to Mushtaq, but Nikolai, you talk again about the capabilities of these organized groups and about the power of local firms and capitalists, etc. That is what distinguishes, that is why, or helps us explain why Mobutu's Zaire and General Park's South Korea can be in the same typological category and yet have very different developmental effects. It's because we think that the results are kind of modified by the power of these other groups, which is something that's also captured by our social foundation in its qualitative detail. Okay. I think we are running over time. I'm not sure if there's one more question, which actually comes from Matthias. Matthias, do you want to come up on stage?
I mean, it's the first time that I see the results, and it's it's great to see. I was wondering, have you by any chance run this? I mean, you're running this right now on sort of standard developmental outcomes. growth and infant mortality reduction. That's perfectly fine. But have you also, is it? And I mean, obviously this is kind of comes from a certain have you run this for world governance indicators by any chance, or other state capacity variables that are usually used, like tax capacity? So have you tried out other variables that are not like outcomes, but more intermittently in the process, focus on state capacity?
So I think I've done correlations and I've included them as control variables, but not yet, I think, as dependent variables. There's a long list of things we want to do with this, and this is definitely one. And actually, we also have a variable coded in our data set, in our survey, where we ask about the implementation capacity, or rather the concentration making decisions, how far that is concentrated in the top leadership, and actually implementing that. And those are some of those intermediate variables that we also want to test. Those correlate very highly with power concentration. But no, we're on it, and VDEM has made a very nice available variable on state capacity, or they call it impartial bureaucracy. So that's might be something you also want to check out, Matthias. They just published a paper on that, Karl-Henrik Knudsen et al. But yeah, so we're thinking about that thoroughly, and I'm sure we're going to discuss more. And I saw you asked another question.
That's more suggestion.
Okay, yeah, basically, yeah. Okay. And actually, Bill, just very quick, I don't know if we're okay, we have 9 minutes, right? So very quickly, because Matthias asked whether we think our results are due to the sample of 42 countries. So essentially the 42 countries weren't really hand selected that much, but they were really selected based on some criteria, like are the countries landlocked, what were the levels of development in the 60s, to create some comparison. That being said, we took some countries from the initial ICID countries into the sample, like Rwanda, which is landlocked. It's not a coastal country like most other countries, but generally we've taken pretty clear and transparent, and I think impartial ways to select the sample, so I don't think it's too much driven by that. But we will admit we have to take in more Latin American countries, and they're not included so much because they had higher levels of development in the 60s than most of the countries that had development that we have in the sample now. Bill wants to come on stage, right?
Yeah,
okay?
I think it's fine. I think that the panel is only scheduled to run until 3:45. I think it's great that people are still with us. And for those who want to stay, then we'll stay in the room a bit. And Bill, you wanted to offer a comment on Mushtaq's comments.
Yeah, okay. Hi, everybody. Yeah, Mushtaq, 2 points you made. One, policy relevance. Absolutely, I think other members have already commented on that somewhat. My take on policy relevance is that the categorization of political settlements helps you identify particular collective action problems that could, in effect, act as binding constraints on certain types of development. And so the framework is relevant for that from that angle. In terms of more detail and more, I agree completely. In other words, you can take the 4 basic quadrants and say, okay, now within this one quadrant, what else is going on? A lot of other things are going on. I've taken a first step on that with respect to distinguishing between paths A and B and C and D on the basis of Donna Ritchie and Slater's notion of, is there a resource constraint, yes or no? Is there a mutually understood threat to the political survival of the elites in a particular settlement? And I think that gives you some distinctions which could, Nikolai and others, be tested empirically. But you've got a bit of control for resources, I think, in there, but there might be more things that can do with that. But secondly, it would be possible to drill down within each quadrant quite a bit further. In other words, we could take exactly the things that Mushtaq is talking about. We could take, okay, we could take something like technical capability, high or low, what's going on there. We could also look at other dimensions of distribution of power, distinguishing between vertical and horizontal, as Mushtaq does in his typologies. So I would argue that the broad four-quadrant typology is just a starting place. And it's a way to get somewhat of a conceptual frame on how do we think about these problems, but by no means is it an end.
Yeah, thanks very much, Bill. I mean, I would agree with that, and it reminds me of Mushtaq's comment that what if we accepted that every country was simply different? So that would be, you know, an invitation to kind of do away with typologies and yet keep these kinds of concepts. And I think that, you know, there has been a debate around political settlements analysis and around development policy advice about whether every country is unique. You know, what should the message be for policymakers? Is that context matters, yes, but every country is not unique. And what we are trying to say is that you can distinguish broadly between different types of country. And as long as you are smart about it, as long as you are nuanced about it and realize that this is only the very starting point of an analysis, then those kinds of typologies can help you get your bearings, as it were. It gives you somewhere to start. But we're fully accepting of the idea that development is a very complex process and there are many different variables and relationships involved. So, clarification, please. Okay. Mushtaq, you can come up again.
Thank you. No, I think that we are all agreed. It's just about how you present the ideas. So a country might be similar to South Korea in its political configuration, but similar to Zaire in its economic configuration in the distribution of power in the economy. Now, do you describe that political settlement as a South Korean type and then we start drilling? Or do you start describing it as a Zairean type and then we start drilling? And I think that, to me, each of these are actually different political settlements. So Pakistan looked like South Korea in its politics, but it was very different from South Korea in its economics. And to me, they're not the same political settlement, although in the political configuration box, they're in the same box. So I would actually describe them as completely different political settlements because all these aspects of power matter in defining your political settlement. That's all. So it doesn't matter which box you start from, as long as you don't describe these two countries as having the same political settlement but different subsets. To me, that's the confusion, right? So all these different aspects of the distribution of power at the sectoral level, at the political level, at the economic level matter, and they matter almost equally. So why prioritize the distribution of power between political parties as your starting point? Why not between economic firms, between the formal and informal sector, between different kinds of clientelist groups? Any of those could be your starting point. So all I'm saying is that for some questions, it's useful to compare countries in terms of their political configuration. For other comparisons, it's useful to compare them on some other criteria. But all of those are part of the political settlement.
Yeah, okay, that's a nice way of putting it. Yeah, I think we definitely need to take that seriously, and we need to think about how we use the theory in presentational terms and which aspects of it we need to emphasize. I think that political scientists love 2x2 quadrants, and when we were doing the background work on this, we looked at many different dimensions, or several different dimensions, shall I say. But the more dimensions you add, the more complex your typology becomes, and you get to the point at which it becomes very difficult to actually explain anything or get anything across in simple terms. But I very much take your point that I suppose that these things may be of equivalent relatively or roughly equivalent weight in any kind of explanations that might be relevant for policymakers.
I have two quick things to say. One, actually, I did put South Korea in a different category. I put it in the broad concentrated. And I think the exception for the coding was the Park regime, 60 to 63, which might be an atypical period for South Korea. So that's a minor comment. But the more major comment that I would have is that the distinction between broad and dispersed, or multipolar and unipolar, does not only depend on political parties. That's only one element of it. It depends on the configuration, the way I put it, configuration of authority amongst powerful groups in the society. And those powerful groups may, in fact, include economic entities. There's no reason that they should not. The empirical measurement of it and the theoretical concept are not exactly the same thing. It's much easier to measure it empirically in terms of the political parties. But I think the theoretical concept is broader than that. Economic groups should, in fact, enter into how do you think about the configuration of power or the configuration of authority in a society.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. It's true that our political blocks do not map perfectly onto political parties. In fact, far from it. We asked people to think about the sort of politically salient groups in society that comprise these blocks, and that might include capitalists of one persuasion or another, different regional groups, ethnic groups, gender groups, various fractional groups. So we have quite a lot of qualitatively rich data, as well as these quantitative categories into which we divide societies. Yeah, I think that probably we've come to time, and I'm very grateful to everybody for listening, and thanks also to the paper givers, thanks to the contributions from the floor. I've enjoyed it enough, and I think we're going to go on. We're going to go on talking about this.